The history books gave them a name based on what they left behind. Bell beakers. The distinctive drinking vessels, shaped like an inverted bell, found in graves across a geographic arc stretching from Portugal to Poland, from Scotland to Sicily. For over a century after their discovery in the 19th century, archaeologists debated what the Bell Beaker phenomenon actually represented. Was it a culture, a religion, a trading network, a fashion that spread from one end of Europe to the other because people liked the look of a particular style of pot? What no one seriously proposed was that it was a people, that behind the spread of these ceramic vessels lay one of the largest and fastest human migrations in the history of Europe, that the Bell Beaker phenomenon was not a trend moving across a continent, but a population moving across a continent, replacing the people who had been there before with a speed and completeness that, when the ancient DNA finally revealed it, left researchers reaching for words that did not feel adequate to what the data was saying. The ancient DNA results published in 2018 did not just complicate the Bell Beaker debate. They ended the old version of it entirely, and what they put in its place was one of the most unsettling findings in the history of population genetics. In Britain, within a few centuries of the Bell Beaker arrival, approximately 90% of the ancestry of the island had been replaced. The people who had built Stonehenge were gone, not moved aside, not absorbed gradually, gone, in genetic terms, with a speed that has no clean explanation and no comfortable name. To understand what the Bell Beaker people were, and why the DNA result was so shocking, you need to understand what Europe looked like before they arrived. By around 2800 BCE, the continent had been settled for thousands of years by the descendants of Anatolian farmers who had spread westward from the Near East, beginning around 9000 BCE. These Neolithic farmers had transformed Europe. They had cleared its forests, planted its first fields, built its first permanent settlements, and raised its megalithic monuments. Stonehenge was theirs, or built by people whose ancestry traced directly back to those original Anatolian migrants. The passage tombs of Ireland, the dolmens of France, the stone circles of Scotland, all of it built by this Neolithic farming civilization that had been the dominant population of Western Europe for over 5,000 years. They were not primitive. They were organized, sophisticated, connected by trade networks that moved polished stone axes from Alpine quarries to Britain. They had a cosmology sophisticated enough to align massive monuments with solar events. They had, in short, built a world. And then the Bell Beaker people arrived. The Bell Beaker culture is first identified archaeologically in the Iberian Peninsula, appearing around 2800 BCE in what is now Portugal. Within a few centuries, it had spread across most of Western and Central Europe with a speed that the purely cultural diffusion model of earlier archaeology had always struggled to explain. The characteristic beakers appear in graves alongside a consistent package of other goods: copper daggers, arrowheads, wrist guards for archery, objects that suggest a mobile, militarized, pastoralist lifestyle quite different from the settled agrarian world of the Neolithic farmers they were moving into. The debate before the DNA focused on mechanism. Did the Bell Beaker package spread because people were adopting a prestige culture, or because the people who carried it were actually moving? Archaeologists spent decades arguing about ceramic typology and grave good assemblages, trying to read the question of human movement from the material traces of pots and copper blades. The answer, it turned out, was not in the pots. The 2018 study that resolved the debate was the largest ancient DNA study ever conducted at the time of its publication. A collaborative project involving over 100 researchers from dozens of institutions across Europe and North America, published in the journal Nature, analyzing ancient DNA from 400 individuals spanning the Bell Beaker period across the full geographic range of the culture. The lead authors included David Reich at Harvard, Johannes Krause at the Max Planck Institute, and Ron Pinhasi at the University of Vienna. The scale was unprecedented. The results were unambiguous. The Bell Beaker people were not a ceramic style. They were a population, or more precisely, they were the archaeological expression of a population movement, one connected to the broader expansion of steppe-related ancestry that had been transforming Europe from the east since the Yamnaya expansion beginning around 3000 BCE. The Bell Beaker individuals in the study carried predominantly steppe-related ancestry, the same genetic signature associated with the Yamnaya and their cultural successors. They were, genetically, part of the same eastward to westward demographic wave that had already transformed Central and Northern Europe, now moving through the Iberian Peninsula and westward into the British Isles and Ireland. This alone was significant, but it was the Britain data that produced the finding that stopped researchers in place. The ancient DNA from Britain before and after the Bell Beaker arrival told a story that no one in the field had fully anticipated. Before the Bell Beaker period, the ancient British population was genetically almost entirely descended from the Neolithic farmers. The Anatolian farmer ancestry that had built Stonehenge and the megalithic monuments of the British Isles was dominant, coherent, and had been stable for over 2,000 years. Then the Bell Beaker people arrived, around 2500 BCE, and within a few centuries, approximately 90% of that Neolithic ancestry had disappeared from the British genetic record. 90%, in a few centuries, in an island population. The genomic data shows that by around 2000 BCE, the people living in Britain had predominantly steppe-related ancestry. The descendants of the Stonehenge builders were, in genetic terms, almost entirely absent. Their monuments remained standing. Their art, their burial practices, their astronomical alignments, all of it still visible in the landscape. But the people who built it had been replaced, in the genetic record, more completely and more rapidly than almost any other population transition documented anywhere in ancient European history. The 2018 study's authors were careful about language. They noted the replacement, quantified it, and declined to speculate in the paper itself about the mechanisms that produced it. But the numbers left little room for comfortable interpretation. A 90% genetic replacement in a few centuries, on an island, is not what gradual assimilation looks like. It is not what peaceful cultural adoption looks like. Whatever happened in Britain between approximately 2500 and 2000 BCE was sudden, was total, and was the kind of event that the genetic record can detect and measure but cannot, by itself, fully explain. The question of mechanism is where the history becomes genuinely uncomfortable. 3 processes have been proposed, and they are not mutually exclusive. The first is epidemic disease. The steppe populations that carried Bell Beaker ancestry had lived for generations, alongside domesticated cattle, horses, and other animals. They may have carried infectious diseases, to which the farming populations of Britain had little immunity. Populations reduced by epidemic disease are populations vulnerable to demographic replacement, not necessarily by conquest, but by the simple arithmetic of differential survival and reproduction. A population that loses half or more of its members to disease in a generation or two can be replaced by incoming groups without anything that would look like organized military action. The second is direct violence. The Bell Beaker cultural package included copper daggers, archery equipment, and the general material signature of a mobile, armed, pastoralist culture, moving into settled agricultural territory. The archaeological record of late Neolithic Britain shows evidence of significant violence in the transition period, though whether that violence was primarily between incoming steppe groups and existing farmers, or between competing steppe groups themselves, is debated. The third possibility, the one that is most difficult to discuss, precisely because it is most difficult to prove, is that the replacement was as rapid and as complete as the genetic data suggests, and that the speed reflects a combination of disease and violence that together produced a demographic catastrophe for the Neolithic farming population of Britain. Not a gradual process of assimilation, not a slow blending, a collapse, followed by replacement. The genetic record cannot tell us which of these mechanisms operated, or in what combination. It can only tell us the result. And the result is one of the most complete population replacements documented anywhere in ancient European history. Here is the thing that the Bell Beaker data forces us to confront, and that the 2018 study's authors gestured toward, but could not fully articulate within the conventions of a scientific paper. The people who are most directly descended from the Bell Beaker migrants are the modern populations of Britain, Ireland, France, the Netherlands, Germany, and much of Western and Central Europe. The genetic legacy of the Bell Beaker people is the genetic legacy of what we now think of as Western European ancestry. Which means that the people reading this, if they are of Western European descent, are overwhelmingly descended not from the builders of Stonehenge, but from the people who replaced them. The Celtic languages, the Germanic languages, the cultural traditions of northwestern Europe, all trace their roots to the steppe-derived cultures that arrived with, or immediately after, the Bell Beaker phenomenon. The Neolithic farmers who built the megalithic monuments left those monuments standing, but left almost nothing else that survived into the modern world in detectable form. Their DNA persists as a minority component. Their language, whatever it was, is gone. Their names are gone. Their stories are gone. What they left are the stones themselves, now surrounded by the descendants of the people who replaced them. This is not a comfortable history. It is not the kind of history that fits easily into the stories that nations and peoples tell about their deep roots in a particular place. The DNA does not care about those stories. It records what happened, regardless of what any subsequent generation has preferred to believe. The Bell Beaker people were never what we thought because we thought of them as a ceramic style, a cultural trend, a fascinating archaeological pattern without a clear human author. What the ancient DNA revealed was that they were people, specific, genetically identifiable, mobile, and extraordinarily successful people who moved through Europe in a few centuries and remade it almost entirely in their own genetic image. The Stonehenge builders were extraordinary. They organized labor across generations to create monuments that have lasted 5,000 years and are still among the most recognizable structures on Earth. They aligned stone with the movements of the sun and moon with precision that required centuries of astronomical observation. They were, by any reasonable standard, a civilization, and they are, genetically, largely gone, replaced by people who were also remarkable, also capable of extraordinary things, but who came from somewhere else, and arrived with copper daggers and bell-shaped cups, and a genetic heritage forged on the Eurasian steppe. That is the Bell Beaker story. Not a story about pottery, a story about one of the most consequential human migrations in the history of Europe, a story about the people who built the most famous monument in the world and the people who replaced them, and a story about what it means to live in a landscape shaped by civilizations whose builders you are not, in any meaningful genetic sense, descended from. The history of Europe is not what we thought it was. The blood in the veins of modern Western Europeans is not primarily the blood of the people who built its oldest monuments. The DNA is very clear about this. What we do with that knowledge, how we hold it alongside the identities and the stories we have built around those ancient stones, is a question that science can raise but cannot answer. The Bell Beaker people have given us one of the greatest gifts that any ancient people can give to the living. They have made the past more true. And more true is always better, even when the truth is harder than the story we had before.